I'm really pleased to be here this morning and to reconnect with old colleagues and friends, some of whom I've done honorable things with, Carlos Serre. Others I have done things that are not that honorable with, like Bruce Scott. I'm just trying to establish a level of comfort in this institution. But even more importantly, I'm just, again, very pleased to reconnect with Sweden. The first time I ever left this country to go overseas was to Sweden in February. And the Swedish Sida thought that it was really wise to take me to the farthest place possible, a place called Kiruna, which is the farthest you can ever go. And I didn't know whether this was a plan to discourage me from associating with Sweden anymore, but it didn't actually work. But I'm glad to see that Sweden continues. Later on, I became a grantee of SIDA and SAREC, and I'm glad to see that Sweden still continues to stress the importance of competence building and capacity building, which is absolutely essential for thinking about long-term development. I was asked to talk about the global bioeconomy. Victor and I wrote a paper with this title exactly 10 years ago. And essentially what we are thinking about is how do you get the products of advances in molecular biology to become important players in economic transformation, both for health, environment, agriculture, and other sectors. Then we were really being speculative at the time in terms of how the life sciences could affect economic transformation. It's no longer that speculative. We're starting to see really significant impacts coming from the life sciences, transforming the way we think about different manufacturing processes, different ways of doing agriculture. And what I would like to do is just to put that in context and try to link it with the possibilities for and the potential that exists for African countries and some of the challenges that we face. But I'm mostly interested in how we solve those challenges, not simply enumerating them. Africa is a big place. Just as from the outset, I just wanted to make it clear that I will use the term Africa, but I also want you to appreciate the size of the continent and the diversity, which is both a challenge but also an opportunity. I actually see it more as an opportunity rather than a challenge. It's so big you can fit the United States in there, China, Western Europe, India, Argentina, and have enough room to sneak in England. So it's a big place. So when people say, "Oh, I work in Africa," I mean, I just say, well, they haven't really seen how big the continent is. This is why it's really important to start thinking about regional bodies, because they're a little smaller and easier to manage with a longer history of regional collaboration. Much of what I'm going to say, in fact, comes out of a book. And this is actually a successor to the report that Carlos referred to earlier, which we did for the African Union. And it just came out, been covered a lot by the media. I was fairly surprised by the level of coverage and interest on the part of the media. It basically makes a very simple, conveys a very simple message, which is that Africa is capable of feeding itself in a generation, and then it lays out kind of strategies that can be adopted to do that. And the most important one is the ability to harness available scientific and technological advances and put them to agricultural production. It's just been reviewed by Nature and Science, and I thought I should just share with you the review from Science particularly, which is where the reviewer thinks the book is way too optimistic and does not think that reflects the optimism on the continent. The reviewer thinks that it's just my dreams and a few colleagues of mine talking around Boston. I was very surprised to see Science actually publish a sentence like that. And I think, as Carlos pointed out, this work has come out of a very extensive observation of what's happening on the continent. I don't know if there's any African at the moment who is not optimistic about the continent. I'm not, hopefully, not the only person who is optimistic. But the reviewer picked up one particular sentence that is relevant for this gathering, which is basically I made a claim in the book that Africa has the capacity to do for the continent, essentially, if we invested in research and human capacity development, was capable of doing in bioinformatics what India has done in the software industry. And I made that comment after talking to a wide range of people working in this field, including leaders in genomics. I had discussions with the team, with Craig Venter's team and Craig Venter himself. And we discussed to a great extent the potential of Africa starting to move into the life sciences and taking advantage of the sequencing of genomes and basically positioning universities to start investing time in annotation of the genomes that are being sequenced. And the view that is shared by, not just by Craig Venter, but is also shared by other leaders in genomics, like the Beijing Genomics Institute, which is very interested, in fact, in partnering with African countries, is that Africa has that potential if it can invest in human resource development, because the limiting factor is human resources. This is a labor-intensive activity, so that's why you need involvement of universities, particularly university students. But the author thinks this is just far-fetched. It's not likely to happen. So my challenge to you is not to demonstrate that I'm right, but actually to prove the author wrong. Actually, the author is a colleague. In academia, you don't get tenure until you have demonstrated that other people are wrong. So this is a very academic way of responding to a new study. And so I'm really interested in how do you, if you take the Doug's criticism, which is that China and India are way ahead of Africa, how does Africa catch up? This is really the area that I'm particularly interested in. And we'll be spending some time thinking about the potential for Africa to catch up. And I'll give some examples where Africa is actually caught up in certain areas. So catching up is not alien to Africa. Already there was some reference made to the issue of climate change. I just wanted to stress that the Africa is going to be applying the biosciences to economic transformation at a time when it has also to worry a lot about climate change. And in fact, think about alternative development strategies that avoid increases in CO2 emissions and other ecological challenges. I think of climate change not just as a sector, but as a metaphor on how to think about ecological degradation, that the responses that we need to be thinking about, whether it's for climate change or for other localized ecological degradation, are more or less the same. I share a view that is now increasingly being supported by a number of people that the next wave of economic transformation is going to be very much driven by the so-called green technologies, that this transition away from chemicals and the classical mechanical technologies into the application of the life sciences is going to be the driver for the next phase of economic transformation. And you can already start to see, even today, some of the investments being made by leading industrialized nations starting to shift, in fact, more and more towards green technologies as a way to chart a new path. This is where the opportunity really emerges for Africa, in that most of the industrialized countries have a lot of difficulties making that transition because they have vested interest in old technologies. Whereas Africa has this unique opportunity of being able to leapfrog because it doesn't have significant investment in old technologies. And I'm not the only person who shares this view. There are a lot of people who have been starting to look at the potential of looking at Africa as the green field for adapting new technologies. In the same way as China is now the leader in area in certain areas of clean energy, certainly in areas of photovoltaics. And most people predict that electric cars will take off in China before they take off in the Western world. And the reason that is possible is because China wasn't as heavily invested in the classical technologies as the US and Western Europe. And we think that Africa has the potential, in fact, to become the next frontier of new industries that are based on the life sciences. And then those industries will start to diffuse worldwide. You can't do that without really a significant investment in knowledge. This is a very knowledge-intensive industry. And without that investment, it's not likely to happen. And that's why I think the work that's going on here on this campus is extremely important in terms of the focus on capacity building. And secondly, starting to create connections between what happens here on this campus with universities in the region and the continent. These are the universities that will start to play a role as locus for the acquisition of knowledge. And that knowledge will get domesticated in Africa and transformed into goods and services as well as new ideas. So it's really about, I'm really interested in this idea of innovation. And I think of innovation in very simple terms, which is getting products from the lab to the marketplace. It's not an innovation until a product is actually on the market. If it is still in the lab, it is not an innovation. And I'm just so thrilled to see that the program that you're launching has a very strong emphasis on getting products to the marketplace. Because as soon as you start to make emphasis on diffusing products to the marketplace, you start to attract other players like the banking institutions, venture capitalists will be interested if they see that your focus is to commercialize a product. And that's really the area that I'm particularly interested in. There are three things that are critical. This is a quick summary. For that to happen, this is now thinking broadly about the region. One is an investment in infrastructure, which is basically 4 critical areas, which is energy, transportation, water, which is largely irrigation, and telecommunications. A lot of the telecoms work is already being taken care of, but it's almost impossible to create an economy if you cannot move goods and services. Economic growth is really driven by the ability to move goods and services. And so ministries of transportation or ministries of roads actually may have a much bigger role to play in agriculture than the ministries of agriculture. Because when you produce anything, the challenge is actually moving it. Food generally is bulky. And this is something that we tend to take for granted. And so decisions on where to invest in terms of expansion of road networks have huge implications for the ability of the economy to actually grow. The second area is the role of higher technical institutions, particularly universities. And I'm mostly interested in universities that are linked to the productive sector, that are not just producing knowledge for the sake of producing knowledge, but are thinking about how you turn knowledge into products and to commercialize those products. And I think the work that is going on here creates really very, very interesting ways by which you can start to think about how you move from research to the marketplace. And I can talk a little bit more about that later on in terms of models that are being adopted by other countries to facilitate commercialization of products. I just wanted to mention here that in the life sciences, there isn't a single country that has made significant advances in the commercialization of life sciences without engaging universities. And it turns out that the best mechanism for diffusing knowledge into the economy is called graduation. When students graduate, they move with that knowledge and they move into the economy. So if all your research is locked up in national research institutes that don't have connection to the students, your impact on the economy is going to be very, very minimal. Alternatively, if you have universities that just they only teach, but they don't do research, their impact is going to be also minimal. So finding ways by which you can bring these players together becomes extremely important. And there's just ample evidence of examples of this kind countries that have taken very radical steps, like cutting all funding to universities and then forcing universities to link up with the private sector before they can restore the funding. This was done both by China and Brazil, just to try to create this link so that students can become agents of economic transformation, so that they can leave the universities with ideas that they can put in the economy as opposed to a piece of paper, which is a certificate. And that's linked to the area of business incubation, which is how you create new enterprises, which is not a lot of the business studies that are kind of dominant among African countries are focused very much on how you manage existing enterprises. In terms of advances in life sciences, what we've seen is really the degree to which various incentive mechanisms have been created, particularly by governments, to make it possible for people to create new enterprises. In fact, the best measure of whether an economy is growing or not is whether it's creating new enterprises. It's estimated that roughly 60% of the new jobs created worldwide annually are created in startups. And so if your economy it doesn't have startups, it's not creating new businesses, chances are that your economy is actually not growing. Secondly, all the enterprises spend a large part of their time, in fact, rationalizing their operations, laying off people. So they're generally not creating jobs. The jobs are usually created in startups. Just think about it. If you have a new company and you employ people, it's 100% employment. It's a big contribution to the economy. And as companies age over time, the ability to create new jobs diminishes because they move into rationalizing the operations. It's a very kind of a simple idea. And that's why many of the industrialized countries really put a lot of emphasis on startups and basically being able to help people create new businesses. And you can't create new businesses unless you have access to technical knowledge. And that's where the link with the universities and research institute ends up being created. Fortunately for Africa, we as a latecomer, this is one of those unusual or counterintuitive areas where latecomers tend to grow very fast, in fact, usually faster than front runners, mainly because they inherit these large pools of scientific and technical knowledge that accumulates exponentially. Many people think that knowledge accumulates in a linear way. Actually doesn't. You know a lot more today than your father knew. And it's not additive, it's exponential. This is when Japan was industrializing, it had access to all the knowledge that had been accumulated in Europe and the US. When Germany was industrializing, it had only access to knowledge mostly coming out of England as a fast mover. When China was industrializing, which it's doing at a very rapid rate, it has access to everybody's knowledge. Now think of Africa today. When Africa starts to grow, Africa has access to everybody else's knowledge, actually more knowledge, has access to more knowledge than China had when it started to industrialize 40 years ago. So when Africa takes off, Africa is likely to grow, in fact, at a pace much faster than China grew. Again, when China was transforming its industrial structure 40 years ago, people who knew this logic of exponential growth could predict that China was going to grow much faster than its predecessors. And it's a very simple mathematical equation. You can work it out. Now, what the limiting factor is that having that knowledge available is not sufficient unless you have people who understand what the knowledge is and they can put it to use. And this is where training is, particularly in the engineering sciences, different aspects of the engineering sciences becomes extremely important. I consider plant breeding to be an engineering science as opposed to being basically a basic science, which is basically using knowledge to create goods and services. We've seen, I'll give you a couple of examples that demonstrate this point in terms of the abundance of knowledge available. When the Human Genome Project was launched in 2003 by the US, it was estimated, the estimate was that it was going to cost something like $300 million. And of course, only the US could launch a program of that kind. When Jim Watson had his own personal genome sequenced in 2008, the same time as Craig Venter sequenced his own genome. These were important developments. They are not vanity projects, they are important developments. Had dropped to $60,000 per genome. Actually, there's a Nigerian who has had his private genome sequenced at $50,000 last year. I don't know what he's doing with that genome. A group of computer companies led by IBM, Hewlett-Packard, and others have come together with a plan to sequence a genome at the cost of about $1,000 by next year. I'm not sure they will achieve that goal, but they'll be close to that goal. And the estimate is that by 2020, you'll be able to sequence any genome at $100, probably in less than an hour, probably in half an hour. And anybody who has been to sequencing machines, you see how they have shrunk. In fact, it doesn't pay these days to actually get into sequencing because you have what used to take a full, big, like 4 times this room 5 years ago. You now have one device that is essentially half a refrigerator that sits on your desk. So the problem is actually a different one, which is how to characterize the genomes, annotate them, and figure out exactly what to do. And that's where we see the entry point for Africa being. Right now, there probably, for my estimates, about 5,000 genomes have been sequenced. So it's just a lot of data that's available that is just waiting to be put to some use. And then Africa has access to new information that its predecessor didn't have access to. For example, satellite-based information. There are about 890 satellites, operating satellites in space today, 1/3 of which are devoted almost entirely to Earth observation. And all that information is being beamed down to Earth. A lot of it is the military sector. Again, the challenge is actually figuring out what it is and working out ways of putting it to use, particularly in agricultural management. This is an opportunity that Africa has access to. The cost of launching satellites has significantly dropped. It's about 1/10 what it was about 15 years ago. So in fact, there's an increasing number of African countries that are starting to launch their own satellites that are basically dedicated to monitoring the ecological regions, which is essential if you're having continuous changes in the ecology. I'm actually working with a colleague of mine at MIT at the moment. He used to be the director of the Aeroastro department to actually develop a space program for East Africa. And it's within reach, it can be afforded because of this continuous drop in the price of technologies and the shortening of time frames between research and commercialization, in that you are not spending the rest of your life and positioning your son to continue improving your product. Products are actually getting to the marketplace much faster today. You've seen it. This is not unfamiliar to you. You've seen it with mobile phones. Most people think they're called mobiles because you carry them around. Actually, that's not why they're called mobile. They are called mobile because when Ericsson, the Swedish company, developed the first phone, you could actually communicate without being physically connected, which was 1956. They decided to call it Mobile Telephone A. And it weighed 42 kilos. You couldn't possibly carry it around. Any of you who are addicted to text messaging, this is not easy to text from. But it was, cars used to be designed so that you can actually put this in a car. And at that time, it was inconceivable that anybody would actually have access to a telephone of this kind unless if they were the military or the police or some institution that had cars. That was the projection of the use of this. Then, of course, came car phones. I don't know if anybody here is old enough to have owned one of those. But it took one guy, Martin Cooper at Motorola, 10 years, who had this vision that he could miniaturize this. This was Dynatac, released in 1983, that cost $4,000 and weighed roughly 2 kilos. And people predicted, say it would never sell. It sold out instantly. These kinds of trends, which is improvement in efficiency, efficacy of products, and a reduction in price has been a trend that many people, particularly policymakers, miss out in that they look at a product, and the general assumption is that products get more expensive over time. Actually, the evidence is exactly the reverse, that over time products are getting cheaper and cheaper, and partly because of economies of scale, but also just because of technological improvement. This was my favorite example of a derivative. This is actually a guy in Ethiopia who was selling rubber bands. He had found a market for rubber bands. This is predates M-Pesa. M-Pesa was not the first derivative of mobile phones. This guy did it long before M-Pesas. That was, I think it's my example of the first Bluetooth. Bluetooth was invented in Ethiopia. It's a very simple, practical reason, which is that herdsmen wanted to keep their hands free, but at the same time stay connected, and that created a market for rubber bands. Of course, the next frontier, which has huge implications for agriculture, is the era of broadband technology. Now, this is about 3-4 years ago, when the rest of this region had no broadband connection, undersea cable at all. And the little that existed on the continent was basically the West African part that was way too expensive. Nobody really used it. It was capacity utilization of roughly 5%. That's what Africa looks like now. And this is a huge investments, roughly, I would say, between $6 and $7 billion invested mostly by Africans in these cables. A huge transformation, and the biggest impact is, in fact, is going to be in the life sciences, particularly in agriculture. It was the SECOM that opened up this whole avenue by spending $650 million, of which roughly 75% of the investors are Africans. People think Africans are not investing. That this is a big investment that is essentially African. 5 of these cables are now operational, and this is it's people who are doing projections say this is actually way below the actual capacity that the continent needs. So this is an expanding field. But the reason why I think this is interesting is because of its potential for agriculture by connecting rural areas. Tanzania has spent something like $400 million wiring terrestrially, internally, within the country. And this is going to rural areas where the impact is likely to be largely agricultural. Rwanda has done the same thing, which is significant investment in terrestrial cables. These are just resources that are being invested by the countries themselves. In fact, very little of it is coming from international aid agencies. And finally, in this area that I think is going to have a big impact on advances in life sciences is a proposal by Google and a few other investors under the so-called the other $3 billion, which is a plan to launch a constellation of 16 satellites in low orbit. Each one of those will have a footprint of about 150 square kilometers. And because you don't have to wire any location actually to have access, you just need to give the company your coordinates, and they can automatically connect you. And the cost is going to be comparable with the terrestrial cables. In fact, the efficiency of these cables is not very different from terrestrial cables. This system is probably going to come on stream in a couple of years. In effect, the entire continent, anywhere on the continent, you'll be able to have broadband access. And this is going to have big implications for the life sciences. If you think of agriculture, you're a farmer somewhere in a rural area, and you notice that your plant doesn't look quite right. The color is slightly different, but you don't know what is doing it. You just take a picture of it with your mobile phone, post it on Facebook, and somebody somewhere in the world is going to tell you exactly what that problem is at no cost, because it's a huge constituency of people interested in sharing their knowledge and helping to solve problems. Basically, the Wikipedia kind of phenomenon is going to be very widely applied, and Africa is going to be a big beneficiary of these kinds of frontier developments. That's what some of the few reasons that kind of give me this view that we are really, as a continent, we're at the cusp of a really major breakthrough using new technologies, especially ecologically sound technologies, to advance economic development. There are those areas that I don't want to get into great details because this is very familiar to you, the area of sequencing of genomes, and I think Margaret Karembo is going to be talking about GMOs, the diffusion of GMOs this afternoon, so I don't want to get into it. But just to show you what's happening, again, most of the Americas have moved into biotech. Asia is become a big player in biotechnology. It's really this region that is just at the beginning with South Africa, Burkina Faso, and Egypt. And it's really very encouraging to see an increase in European countries starting to adopt GM crops as well, because our fate has historically been tied to what has been going on in Europe, particularly the debates taking place in Europe. And many of you who follow this know that there are very, very interesting discussions going on within Europe on basically expanding the space for the adoption of genetically modified crops for a variety of reasons, obviously of relevance to that region. Most people who are following this closely know that, can tell you that probably in 2 to 3 years, there's going to be about 4 other African countries that will be growing genetically modified crops, starting mostly with a fiber like cotton, and then moving into feed, and then subsequently down the line, moving into food crops, just as a kind of a precautionary measure. This is a work that's going on again here in this region on drought-tolerant crops. And then my interest is shifting a little bit to concerns about climate change and thinking about how to recruit new crops into the agricultural system, particularly tree crops. And this is a challenge I want to leave with you and your programs here, in that cereals are very vulnerable to changes in the ecology, and most of them have been selected over many, many years, and they are adapted to very specific ecological conditions, so that when there's a slight change in the temperature or rainfall, it just messes it up. But we know that trees are a lot more resilient. And so the question is, can we identify tree crops worldwide that could become part of the agricultural system? And one that I've been looking at closely, and I want to encourage you to really look into, is breadfruit, which is it's the size of a football. And each tree produces something like 100 of them. There's the Breadfruit Institute in Hawaii has, over the last 20 years, collected specimens literally worldwide, and has already started sharing the varieties, improved varieties, with various countries. Very high productivity that's comparable to, actually higher than many of other crops. Nutritionally, again, not very different from our staples. This is actually bread from breadfruit. This is the protein content that is comparable. And this breadfruit hasn't been the subject of much research in terms of figuring out how to improve, say, protein content. It would be a classic example of a product that could be introduced here, because the group that's developed it is in fact commercializing. Right now is commercializing seedlings. And their first target has been the Caribbean. The ecological zones in which they can grow it is basically the tropical regions. Large parts of Africa, in fact, can support it. I was looking at some satellite imagery to see where breadfruit actually grows, and found some of it actually growing in parts of Tanzania. So it is in this region already growing, but it's used essentially as a farming crop. And the question is, how can we take a product of this kind and actually move it into a large-scale commercial application without just limiting it to pockets of economic activity. And there's numerous other candidates of this kind, people who work on characterization of biological resources worldwide, will give you a long list of tree crops that have the potential of being adapted to Africa. So this is a challenge I want to leave you with, just using this as an example. It's both a crop but also a forest for reforestation, so you have a kind of a double benefit, both for food security but also for ecological benefits. This was a recent introduction of the crop of breadfruit by the Breadfruit Institute in Jamaica. And I could tell that this is Jamaica because this gentleman is particularly interested in the leaf. just that's the only way I could establish that this is Jamaica. You can see he's just curious about the leaf. I'm running out of time, so I won't deal very much with transgenic trees. I'll just get into the area of livestock. I've always wondered why we don't have a university in this region that's devoted entirely to livestock. Kenyans get really excited about nyama choma. And they have research institutes for everything, universities with the programs on everything. I would like to see actually a university dedicated solely to livestock. And even more importantly, Carlos, this is another challenge for you. A lot of animals have been sequenced. I've been wondering, when is somebody going to take up the sequencing of the goat? The goat seems to be a very important animal here. When you sequence it, you might actually find some new attributes of the goat. So, Carlos, this is my challenge to you. That's actually goats in Morocco. This is not an invitation to Kenyans to move to Morocco. Let me conclude by making a couple of comments about what this all means in terms of public policy, because the work that you do is really important. But it will not get very far until governments also start to focus on innovation as an important part of their day-to-day operation, so that it's not just left, say in the case of Kenya, left to one person, one institute. At least one thing that we argue in this book is that heads of state should really spend a part of their time thinking about innovation, and there are good reasons for saying that. One is that where we've seen significant advances in the life sciences having an impact on the economy, we've also seen a conscious effort to promote continuous interactions between government, business, and academia and research institutes as a deliberate effort to get these players to actually work together, not just occasionally at a workshop or a conference, but deliberate efforts to make sure that they really work together as a team, and when an idea comes forward that is bankable, to think about which banks might be interested in picking it up. This is a conscious effort by government. So this area of continuous interaction between government, industry, and academia is something that it's very hard to do from a ministry. It's a lot easier to do from a higher level coordination. Malaysia is just creating right now a piece of legislation to reform the higher education system so that it can link it directly to the productive sector. But this work is being done in the Prime Minister's office, not in the Ministry of Science and Technology. They tried the Ministry of Science and Technology. That wasn't enough. They have elevated it to the Prime Minister's office. In fact, they will create a department in the Prime Minister's office to coordinate this activity. So I've been very interested, and my work right now is just focusing on advocacy with heads of state. The book that we've just published is really aimed at presidents And the message I'm conveying to presidents is that it's not enough for a president to just sit there and look pretty. And so this is what I'm doing at the moment. Is just talking to presidents. In fact, the copies of this book are already being forwarded to heads of state, and I'm using every avenue that I have. In fact, we are bringing 1,000 copies to Nairobi so that ILRI can help through the diplomatic missions here to actually get them to presidents. And I found out that one copy to a president is not enough. The president of Tanzania has been trying for quite a while to launch a program on agriculture. And many people around him were saying, no, agriculture, why don't we move into industry? And so he was being pushed back quite a bit. He launched a program on agriculture at Davos early this year, which is really remarkable. But I kept sending him autographed copies of this book. And after he got the fourth copy, he called me up and said, please, enough. So I'm using everything I have at my disposal to get these copies to the presidents, and I can tell you one is not enough. And so I have 1,000 copies that will emanate from Carlos. I have another 1,000 copies that will emanate from South Africa, from Agram Bali's office in the NEPAD office. I have another 1,000 that will emanate from Farah in Ghana, and so I just trying to get the message across. And also dealing a lot with this whole area of regional integration. I can't emphasize this anymore, and I'm glad that the focus of this program is really around regional issues, because there's just a lot that could be done through regional bodies. And more importantly, these bodies were created solely for purposes of standardizing activities, harmonizing the operations. And I would like to see actually donor agencies work more with these organizations. They have a lot of political influence that is not adequately being harnessed at the moment. They are very involved in the coordination of activities, the roadmaps of making sure that countries actually work together. And finally, on the funding issue, I just wanted to point out that the support that you have is very important, which is the getting some things, research done, which is somewhere around here. But to get to what is really an innovation, which is getting products to the marketplace, you need to start engaging a much larger number of financial players that have different interests. Their behavior is very different. They respond to different kinds of institutions. And until you really start to get the venture capitalists, the banks, people who are interested in launching new IPOs, really very little happens. And the little that happens really very slowly. And when we launched this book in London recently, we specifically wanted to talk to people in the banking and business sector. And it was really interesting. Something like half of the 160 people that turned up came from the financial sector, who are thinking about innovative ways of financing agriculture. And so I think the work that we are starting to do here, especially the support that you have from Sweden, that can be used to leverage other players. But you won't get other players showing up unless you actually have a product that way you have done a due diligence, and you can demonstrate that that product is viable, can get to the marketplace, and you'll start to see banks showing up. We've documented in the book examples of countries where banks have opened branches at universities so that they can scout for ideas and fund them right there at the university level. And I think this campus is positioning itself to really become a place where banks and financial institutions can actually come to. I get a lot of requests in my own office regularly of people who say, I have money, I want to invest somewhere in agriculture in Africa, where can I go to? But those are people who have made their money through technology-based ventures. They will only go to a place where there's something that looks like a technology. They are not interested in just classical distribution of commodities. And this, I would say that the biggest job that we really need to do and Carlos, I want to offer myself to work with you on this, is really thinking carefully how to bring these different players together, because that's really what's going to get these products into the marketplace. And I was going to talk about issues of risk, but I think I will leave you with a hopeful message that if you really do very well, I think that was you. I think that was Carlos. I think I'm done.